Hello, everyone. Welcome in. I want to give everyone just a couple of minutes to join in. Everybody's still joining as we're just beginning. While we're waiting, I wanted to give you the opportunity to scan the QR code on the slide shown, or you can click the link below the cameras under resources. It says virtual hospital to take a moment to explore the virtual hospital that is interactive and full of all sorts of fun things that you can do. So go ahead and take a look at that while we wait for people to join. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Basics of Medical Respiratory Filtration and Humidification. I'm Cassie Soltman of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by Pall Medical. To learn more, visit the link below in resources titled Learn More About Us. We encourage you to participate today by submitting any questions you may have during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. Also, if you experience any technical issues, you can use this Q&A box and we will assist you directly. I'd like to now welcome our speaker, Anders Metzig, registered nurse, BSc Economics at Pall Medical. Anders, you may now begin your presentation.
Welcome to Pall Medical Education. Today we'll touch on some filtration basics and the importance of an optimal humidification of ventilated ICU patients. Please note that this webinar contains confidential and proprietary information owned by Cytiva and Danaher. In this session, we'll work through the mechanics of filtration basics and then dive a bit deeper into passive humidification. What's in it for you today? Well, as mentioned, the deeper understanding of filtration and why we can catch something that is as small as a virus, even if the classical grid is not small enough. Also, a deeper understanding of optimal passive humidification using a BB100 as an example. And I personally like the third benefit, and that is to feel better. I strongly believe that training and education is fun, and I always feel good if I learn something. So, let's have some fun together. We'll start with a few remarks on who Pall Medical is and where it sits in the company's landscape. a few very brief medical facts to align us all on some basics, and then the main theme of filtration and humidification. And if I haven't exhausted you with all my talking, we'll have a bit of Q&A at the end. This is me. I'm a registered nurse and worked 10 years in various hospitals in northern Germany in ICU and anesthesia. And by the way, yes, I am German. I live in Germany. I grew up there. I was born there. I spent a bit of time in the US when I was young and worked 20 years for American companies. And I think that's what you hear. But English is not my mother language, so please bear with me if I struggle sometimes for the right words. After my hospital experience, I went into the industry. I've been working for several companies in the last 20 years or 23 years, always related to the medical field. During that time, I also studied economics on top to have a good business foundation. I have a wonderful wife and 2 great children. I used to have the age of my children listed, but, well, I choose to be a bit more generic on that one. They're out of the house. What can I bring to the table today? I support business growth through education and training. And I think it's extremely important for every business to have training, not just as a side note, but as a strategic function. I like the quote from John F. Kennedy, who said, "There's only one thing in the long run more expensive than education, and that's no education." I also support individual progress, and perhaps today is one of those opportunities in this webinar. And at the end, I hope everybody can learn something new today and feels good about it. Which leads me to something you can do today, and that is please find out what you can take home, and if possible, apply what you've learned. That would be just fantastic. When I don't work, I like to work with woods and other materials. I like to repair some things. A bit of guitar playing and a bit of fishing. Trying to keep a little bit of work-life balance to keep me happy. Let's jump into a quick overview of where Pall Medical fits into the landscape. Mid of last year, 2023, Cytiva and Pall merged into one company called Cytiva. Cytiva, which now includes Pall Life Science, forms the biotechnology reporting sector for Danaher. We are complemented by the life science and diagnostic businesses, and Pall Medical is a nested opco within Cytiva focusing on medical filtration. Within Cytiva, we have 4 operating companies: bioprocessing, genomic medicine, discovery and medical, and biotechnology integrated solutions. Pall Medical sits within discovery and medical. You can see our main opco functions listed, which builds an incredible cross-functional force to provide high experience, high expertise, and support to our customer. One of the main portfolio within Pall Medical is our breathing and gas filtration portfolio, with our Ultipo 100, or also called BB100, as our ICU HMEF. And we'll talk about the HMEF in more details in a minute. Let's have a few slides on some medical basics, linked to breathing filtration to understand why filtration and humidification is essential. First, I want to focus on our respiratory tract. We have the upper respiratory tract, like your mouth, throat, nose cavity, leading into your lower respiratory tract with your trachea, bronchus, getting smaller and smaller over into your bronchioles, and at the end, some bubbles called alveoli. Some fun facts about your lung. It weighs about 1.3 kilogram. If you would connect all the bronchioles branches into one lung string, it would be about 2,400 kilometers long. And at the end, you have roughly about 3 to 500 million alveoles. If you add up the surface of the inner alveoles, it would end up to about 50 to 75 square meters of gas exchange, which is the main function of the lung. This lung needs to be in good and moistured condition to function well. And that's where your nose plays an important role. Yes, your nose is not only for good looks and to hold your glasses. There are 3 main functions I want to underline. It filters, it heats up the air, it humidifies the air. It is your physiological HMEF. Keep that in mind when we later talk about HMEFs. It stands for heat and moisture exchanging filter. And just to mention it already, when we talk about ICU filter, most of the people mean HMEF, not just HME. HME would be heat and moisture exchanger. They exist and are usually a kind of a sponge, and they only do heating and moisturing. But when it comes to filter with ventilated patients, we usually talk about HMEF, so it has the filter part in it as well. Back to our nose. It does some first filtering, heating, and applies moisture, so that within the lungs we have an optimal climate. The moisture is important to keep up what we call mucociliary clearance. A gel and soil layer with lots of little hair-like structure covering the surface, and through its movement it clears the lung from unwanted objects. And that layer has to stay in its optimal conditions. And I think we can all agree on the fact that less humidity and too much of it can damage or limit the functionality of the system. Another fact is that the humidification of the upper respiratory tract is vital, and I'll come back to that when we talk more in depth about the humidification of ICU patients. Now we'll add a bit of filtration mechanics. A quick look at some sizes, starting on the right with the big ones, the bacterias, going over to the left into viruses, prions, etc. I just highlighted some of the viruses. About 0.08 micron or 80 nanometers. That is pretty small, right? Quick fun fact. What does a virus, a soccer ball, and Earth have in common? Well, the first answer I usually get is they're all round. Well, but that's not what I mean. It's the ratio between them. The size ratio between the virus and a soccer ball is roughly the same as the ratio between the soccer ball and Earth. So now, how come we can catch such a small object like a virus? Physics is an amazing subject, and we have three main mechanisms which help us to catch even extremely small objects. The first one is the one everybody thinks of when they think about filtration. It's a grid. Holes and membranes which are small enough to catch objects. This is called direct interception. Whatever is too big will not pass through. The second effect is called inertial impact. As particles get smaller, they would fit through some of the holes, but they cannot change direction very fast. So when they may pass some of the holes, because of their inability to move around sharp corners, they will hit the filter material and be held back. The last effect is called diffusional impact. The extremely small objects may be able to fit through the holes, but because of their small size, the environment has such an effect on them that they cannot go straight. They wobble around, meaning their footprint is much bigger than their actual size, and because of the movement, they hit the filter material and are caught. Those three effects in combination enable us to catch that big range of objects, including the very, very small ones. Let me do a funny analogy so you'll not forget those three effects. Pretend the filter material is a forest with lots of trees. Direct interception is you coming with a big truck. You're just too big and will hit the first trees. No way to pass. Inertial impact is like the motorcycle rider. He may fit through some of the space between the trees, but he's too fast and cannot change direction fast enough. He'll also end up on a tree. And the diffusional impact is the drunken bicycle rider. He could fit between the trees, but because he's wobbling around, going all over the place, he will hit the trees as well. Well, hope you'll never forget those three effects. In the graph below, you can see how those effects work together. Diffusional impact for the small parts, and when that effect fades out, the inertial impact kicks in. And to the right, the direct interception also comes into place. And as you can see, it's actually not the small objects that are the hardest to catch. It's around 0.3 micron where diffusional and inertial impact handshake, which are the most difficult to catch. That's where the quality of the membrane makes a big difference. For example, media thickness, pore size, depth of membrane, flow, and the flow in relation to the media, that has a big impact on the quality and the effectiveness of the membrane. So, with a decent filter, we can build that barrier and stop that transmission of bacteria and viruses to protect our patient, our staff, families, and friends. Now let's jump into the subject of humidification. A few basics. Absolute humidity is the actual amount of water vapor in the air. Relative humidity is a percentage of water vapor in the air compared to the absolute amount that could be held in the air at a certain temperature. For example, if I would have 44 milligram per liter at 37 degrees Celsius, that will be 100% relative humidity, because that's the absolute amount the air could hold at that temperature. If I would only have 22 milligram per liter in the same air, it would be only half of what the air could hold, hence 50% relative humidity. And you can see in the graph on the right a list of how much water vapor can usually be held in the air at what temperature. Some more facts around water and filtration. Water droplets are between 1 and 40 micron in size, and we just saw the size of bacteria and viruses. Water droplets are a perfect medium of transportation for those nasty little things. If you look at water vapor, that's too small, only 0.1 to 0.3 nanometer. Conclusion here is that the filter media itself plays an important role in preventing bacteria and viruses of passing through if you use a hydrophobic membrane, because hydrophobic membranes don't let water pass through, whereas hydrophilic membrane let water pass through. Now, why is that important for ventilation? We've all experienced what happens if you have a certain amount of water vapor in the air and suddenly the temperature drops. Talking about the dew point, where the water is 100% saturated. For example, in the shower in a room with a window. Air with high amount of humidity hits the cold air directly at the window surface. That air cannot hold as much vapor. So it forms droplets, which you can see running down the window. Same thing can happen during ventilation. Here a picture of a filter that protects the ventilator from contamination. Good point is that this filter is doing its job. It builds that barrier we just talked about, despite the water droplets inside. What happened is water vapor passed through, but the potentially contaminated droplets will not pass through. And now we get to the exciting functionality of hydrophobic pleated filter membrane and how important they are for an optimal humidification of long-term ventilated patients. We're back to the term HMEF. The filter membrane takes over the role of reflecting heat and moisture and filtering the air from pathogens. When the patient exhales, heat and moisture is held back at the membrane, and when the patient inhales, that heat and moisture goes back into the lungs. And how effective that can be is what we go into next, which is our final subject for today. This is a spontaneous breathing patient, physiological condition. The patient inhales and the usual air has about 10 milligram per liter average humidity in it. In the upper respiratory tract, the body adds about 25 milligram per liter. Now we're at about 35 milligram per liter. The lower respiratory tract adds now 9 milligram per liter. And then the air in our lungs contain about 44 milligram per liter, which is a cozy 100% saturation at 37 degrees Celsius. And that is what the lung needs to perfectly function. You remember, too dry, too wet is not good and would compromise the functionality of the lung. When we exhale, unfortunately, the respiratory tract does not work like a sponge, and we can only gain back about 2 milligram per liter in the lower and about 8 milligram per liter in the upper respiratory tract. Total loss of about 24 milligram per liter, which is fine because that's what the body is used to. And we replace the liquid in our body with our hot chocolate in the morning or other ways to fill up our liquid. Also note that the main humidification work is in the upper respiratory tract, and the lower only contributes with a much smaller amount. Now let's have a look at an intubated patient with just the tube and no other humidification technology. The intubated patient gets medical air out of the wall, which is very dry and only has about 1 milligram per liter. Since the patient is intubated, we bypass the HME functionality of the upper tract, and only about 7 milligram per liter is added, which is some moisture attached to the side of the tube wall. Now we're only at a level of 8 milligram per liter, meaning the lower respiratory tract would now have to add 36 milligram per liter to get to the required 44 milligram per liter for physiological conditions. And obviously our body is not designed to do that for long, and we would damage the lung. The exhaling figures remain pretty much the same. 2 milligram at the lower part and about 7 milligram per liter is mainly attached to the inside of the tube. But keep in mind, now the main loss of water comes from the lower part of the lungs, which, as we already mentioned, is not physiological and can lead to damage on long term. Now we're looking at a solution with a decent HMEF. In this case, this patient has a BB100 filter. That's what the figures are based on. This time, I'll start on the expiration side. We've got the typical 2 milligram in the lower part and the 7 milligram on the upper part. But now we have the BB100, which is able to contain about 27 milligram per liter. If we switch to the inspiration now, we've got the 1 milligram from the wall. Now the filter adds back the 27 milligram per liter in the inspiration. The rest of the upper tract can add that 7 milligram per liter from the tube's walls. And now you can see that we are at 37 milligram per liter, and the lower part only has to add the 9 milligram per liter to get to the needed 44 milligram per liter, and we are back to physiological condition. And that's exactly the same amount the lower tract had to add as a spontaneous breathing patient. And that's the main message. With a decent filter designed for long-term ICU ventilation, like this BB100, we're back to physiological conditions. And that, in combination with the phenomenal bacterial and virus retention, I think that is an ideal HMEF for a ventilated patient. Closing with a great quote from Leonardo da Vinci: "The noblest pleasure is the joy of understanding." I hope I could give you a good general overview of filtration and passive humidification of ventilated patients. I also hope that you had a bit of that great joy of understanding, and it all made sense to you. My only ask again would be, think about it. Find out for yourself and apply the knowledge whenever you get in contact with your ICU patients. They'll be grateful for your actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your informative presentation. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. Joining us for the live session is Enrique Vargas with Cytiva. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen, and we'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for. Go ahead here. And Anders and Enrique, if you just want to go ahead and unmute and join us here for the Q&A session. Perfect, thank you. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. Our first question states, kindly explain the tidal volume term. Why is it important for filter choice, and what are the tidal volume ranges for Cytiva HMEs?
Yeah, I think I can take that one. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think so. Okay, great. Well, tidal volume, basically, tidal volume is the breath you're taking. You have different volumes. If you're just breathing, your regular breath you're taking is the tidal volume. Somewhere roughly around 500 milliliter. There's a lot of formulas where you can actually really calculate it, and it also depends on obviously the I was about to say the customer, the patient, and its conditions. Now, what you have to consider, obviously, you have to have the right tidal volume, the right volume of that breath when you have a ventilated patient to make sure your gas exchange is enough. And again, depending on the lung the disease or the conditions you have to adjust that tidal volume. Now, when it comes to ventilated patients, you have that tube, and then in front of the tube, you have the filter, and then you have the tube to the ventilator itself. And where the tube starts, it's called the white piece, and between the white piece and basically the lung or the corner, the furthest corner of the lung, that's what we call dead space. That's actually gas which is just moved and not really exchanged old air with new air. So everything you add on between the mouth and that Y piece basically adds to that dead space, meaning that your breath has to be deeper or adjusted. And that's why the tidal volume is so important. When you set up a ventilation, you need to make sure, okay, how much dead space did I add? How much, how big is the filter? And have to adjust that ventilation setting. And to the question, what's the tidal volume? To be honest, I don't really like to give. I'm not even sure if we do have a fixed milliliter in our IFU right now, because it really depends on the patient. And it's kind of funny when you set your tidal volume. The first thing you do is you run the ventilation, and when you do blood gas analysis, you see what's the effect and how do you need to adjust that. And it really depends on the patient, the condition of the patient, the lungs, and whatever, to set that tidal volume. So with that 500 milliliter, maybe you can reduce this, maybe you need to reduce it, because if the tidal volume gets too big, then it's about stress and strain to your lungs and the lungs conditions. So you need to find the optimal tidal volume to have the optimal gas exchange. Hopefully that answers that question, give you a little bit of a few numbers, but still making sure it's up to the patient. And if you can go down to 200, 250 milliliter if you need to, or maybe even more, whatever. It depends on the patient.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, moving on to our next question here. This question says, please can you explain why we would then actively humidify a patient if the HMEF reintroduces enough moisture?
Yep. I'm sorry. That's a question I get a lot, and I ask a lot around with active humidification and passive humidification. And I don't want to step on anybody's toes. My personal experience is a lot of time that question is more of a religious question. If you talk to a lot of people, there's the fighters for the active humidification and the fighters for the optimal, passive humidification. And that's the reason why I was trying to explain today, give you just the facts and figures behind it. And my advice here is actually talk to the ones working at the patient, talk to the doctors, the nurses, talk to the ones who have the experience, and try it out yourself. In my opinion, with the facts I gave you today, I think optimal passive humidification is, physiological conditions. So I really enjoyed that, and always thought that will cover most of the patients. Not saying there may not be a reason, but again, talk to the physicians, do that, and try it out and find out for yourself.
Excellent, thank you. All right, moving on to our next question here. We have a ton of great questions coming in, so please keep submitting them. We will get to as many as we have time for. Our next question asks, what is the water loss values of Cytiva filter, and what is this function's importance?
Yep. And I hope if you get the chance to revisit the video afterwards, we have those 3 slides, which explained, what kind of water loss that we have. So if you're, if you're looking at those figures again, how do I say that? So the water, the B100 contains about 27 milligram per liter. So that's the water. No, sorry. It's very complex. And that's why, if you look at those 3 pictures, the spontaneous breathing, the intubated patient, and the patient with a HME filter, your general water loss of a spontaneous patient would be 22 milligram per liter. The one of an intubated patient would be 34 milligram per liter. And the important part is that that water loss then mostly comes out of the lower part of the lung, which is not designed to add that much of water. Because of bypassing when you intubate a patient. And then if you have that filter again in that equation, then you're back to physiological condition, which is about that 24 milligram per liter of loss. And I hope that makes sense. If you need more information, you can always, I would say, give me a call and we can go through those slides again. As I said, it's a bit complex, but those are about the figures.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, moving along here to our next question. This question says, based on your experience, what was the best filter for a patient that has severe inflamed esophagus or respiratory tract?
BB100. It's the ICU filter, and as I said, if you design a filter, it's always a trade-off between size, weight, humidification, filter efficiency, and handling. In general, the filter efficiency is the same with all of our filters. The other conditions, like the size, for example, dead space, added dead space, what I talked about earlier, and things like that, depends on the application. So in our program, we have a small filter, BB25, which is good for paramedics, for surgery, for example. It's a very small because we don't need that much humidification for long-term because it's just short-term use. And we have another filter for device protection, but for ICU patient, and I assume with the patient you're mentioning, they have a severe lung disease or in the respiratory tract, some problems, some issues, that would be the ICU filter, which is the BB100. And that is an optimal size, not adding too much dead space, so have enough room for therapy and setting the tidal volume, but have enough space and enough surface for humidification to keep that climate optimal in the lung. So that would be my personal experience, my personal recommendation for a filter, an ICU filter.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, this next question asks, how would an electrostatic filter compare to the hydrophobic in adding moisture back?
Oh, electrostatic filter. And again, my personal experience, and that is based on some tests and some studies, and what you can see. Again, find out for yourself. As far as I know, electrostatic filter don't handle moisture very good at all. They're good, and if you have laboratory conditions and you read some of the laboratory numbers and figures about efficiency, as far as I know, they don't really do any climate humidification. But again, I'm not the expert in when it comes to humidification of electrostatics, because the experience we had is as soon as an electrostatic filter gets wet, or a lot of those electrostatic filter out there, they have a small disc usually, and a lot of them have a hydrophilic condition. They don't have a hydrophobic surface, meaning if there's water coming in, they break through. That's things we could, and that's when we talk to customers and other people, and what we saw in laboratories and things like that. So as far as I know, wet conditions with electrostatic filter, not really good. And you can read studies yourself about the efficiency of viral and bacterial retention, which is dramatically less than a pleated hydrophobic filter. And as far as I know, the long-term ventilated patient conditions for humidification is not really a good subject with that. That's my personal opinion. Again, talk to the experts out there.
Okay. All right. Coming back to the question of tidal volume, our doctors are asking at which tidal volume range we use BB25G or U50 or BB100E.
Yeah. It comes back to what I explained early on. There is some rules of thumbs when you ventilate a patient, either in anesthesia or a paramedic or wherever you are, you have that somewhere between, and that's again my own experience when I worked in that field, somewhere around 300 to 500 milliliter. Obviously, you're looking at the condition: does the patient have a full lung and things like that, and what kind of, and then when you start the ventilation, the first thing you do is after a while you do blood gas analysis and see, is that efficient or not. That's why I'm always hesitant to say, okay, with a BB25 you can go with down to whatever 100 milliliter tidal volume or something like that, or BB100 to 150 or something like that. I always say, set up your ventilation according to the patient's conditions, and then you see the blood gas analysis, because it's completely different for each patient and the lung conditions. And as long as you have that optimal gas exchange, you go for the lowest tidal volume, usually in that ventilation settings. And the numbers I was talking about, somewhere around 150, 200, that's, then you're getting into a very low part. And you have to make sure you stay above that dead space, that mechanical and physiological dead space, to make sure you have enough gas exchange. So my recommendation would be never a static number. It would be have a kind of a standard setting, and then look at your gas exchange, what's good for that patient.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, our next question says, you talked about the BB100. Do you have other filters, and do they have the same humidification?
Yeah, as mentioned early on, we've got like 3 main categories. That's the BB25, small one. It's somewhere around, I think, let me have a look. I got the number here, 35 milliliter volume. And then we've got the BB100, about 85 milliliter, and we've got the UltraPro 50, about 50 milliliter, somewhere in between there. And as I said, it's different applications. The small one, short-term ventilation, paramedics, surgery, wherever you need for short-term ventilation, and then BB100 ICU, long-term ventilation, and UltraPro 50 device protection. From a humidification point of view, again, BB100 ICU ventilation, optimal, passive humidification for long-term. The BB25, it does have some humidification, but definitely not designed for long-term ventilation. It's widely used in anesthesia, for example. And as you know, anesthesia, you have a complete different setting there. You have some humidification coming out of that, the solder line, the semicircle system, semi-closed circle system, and humidification is not really questioned there anyhow. But again, not designed for long-term. And same with the UltraPro 50, more short-term ventilation and not long-term ventilation for humidification.
Okay, great, thank you. Our next question asks, how about the dead space? ICU filter always looks pretty big.
Yeah, and that's what I said early on. It's that trade-off you're having about the size and adding to dead space, keeping it as small as possible, but as big as needed. So as I said, BB25, short term, you don't need a lot of humidification. You can keep it very small. But again, if you come to humidification, you need some surface, and that's why you need to have that little bit of trade-off and say, okay, it's a little bit bigger. And also the handling of it. It's just the conditions you're having, and you have to deal with. You need that humidification, so that's when we designed that. As I said, we took it as small as possible, good to handle, but with the optimal humidification part. Always kind of a trade-off.
Okay, great. This next question says, how about active humidification?
Yep, and we had that early on. I would say, again, talk to the expert there. My personal opinion is the optimal passive humidification will cover most of the ICU patients there. There may be some incidents and some conditions where you may want to use active humidification. Again, talk to the physicians, the doctors, the nurses there. But for the majority of the patient, and that was the main reason today, is get some facts and figures behind that and share with you, this is what the filter does. This is what the, physiological conditions we're trying to get with this filter. And we have obviously loads of experience and studies around that optimal condition. And that will be my personal advice. Have a look, try it out yourself, and then build your own opinion around that.
Okay, wonderful. We have time for one more question here. This last question says, how about those 0.3 micron objects? Do they all pass through?
Yeah, that was actually one of the first questions I said as well when I looked at that graph. And I don't know if you remember those three filtration mechanics where where you have that inertial impact and the other, I don't know, it's probably we can't get that slide back. It's that 0.3 micron, which is the most challenging size, where they would pass a lot of that pass through, and it's then really up to the quality of the membrane. And when I mean quality of the membrane, I talk about the thickness of the membrane, for example, or the structure of the membrane. If you'd have a regular grid where all the holes would be above each other, obviously, the very small virus would just pass through. If you have an asymmetric membrane and it's thick enough, then obviously there's a lot more chance to catch even those 0.3 micron particles. Also, the angular, like as I said, pleated hydrophobic filter. So our membrane is kind of like a zigzag going up and down. It's pleated filter, and you can imagine if you have a small disc, the small particles, they have just a small disc to pass through and get a chance to catch, some of the material. If you have pleated membrane, it's, going up and then it kind of hits it in a very steep angle, meaning it travels through a lot of material, and the chance to, could get caught is a lot higher. And there's some other conditions there which makes up that quality of the membrane. And then we can also catch those 0.3. And we talk about that because the 0.3, it's called a salt penetration test, because there is an ISO standard test around the world which can be used that covers exactly that most challenging size, and that's what we test our filters against. And we're pretty proud of that as well, that we have fantastic results in that retention of that size.
All right, wonderful. Thank you all for your time today and your important research. We would also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, Pall Medical, for underwriting today's educational webcast. Before we go, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today and their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today, and those submitted during the on-demand period, will be addressed by our speaker via the contact information we provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.